I was talking to a friend of mine who works in sports, and he said that as successful as Rich Paul is, that white athletes and white families, they don't trust a black sports agent. Do you have any white American athletes?
Not one.
Wow.
Welcome to the Dark Times channel. And before I go ahead and get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that like button for me. And if you're not new to the channel and you enjoy the content so far on this channel, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me as well. And so let's go ahead and get into it. As you all may know, NBA sports agent, mega sports agent Rich Paul is doing a media tour right now, and he's promoting his new book and also promoting his multi-million-dollar sports agency. And he's done a number of shows. He's been on 60 Minutes and a plethora of other shows and networks going around talking about his experience growing up and going from selling throwbacks and sports memorabilia at the back of his trunk into where he is now. And so that's a good thing. That's a good thing to see on how individuals from the community are able to navigate and even circumnavigate in a sports world that's been traditionally somewhat hostile to people who look like Rich Paul. And so Rich Paul was asked a particular question. He was asked whether or not white players and white families trust him.
White athletes and white families, they don't trust a black sports agent. So I wanted to know, is that an accurate statement?
That's accurate, yeah.
And Rich Paul emphatically said, hell no. Now, for Rich Paul to come out and say that, that speaks volumes, because most so-called black sports agents would have tap danced around that like Sammy Davis Jr. But this is somebody in Rich Paul who knows what time it is. This is somebody that is talking about his own experiences. And before I play the audio, I just want to go ahead and preface by saying, this is not a so-called victim mentality video. I don't make videos to complain, but rather to explain why things are. Because once you can identify something and understand a thing, then you can start to come up with some solutions. And that's something that really ticks me off when I hear that victim mentality. Whenever we try to identify issues within the community and identify issues within society, for that matter, we're the only group of people that gets chastised for having this so-called victim mentality. It's not like we're asking for a handout, because we never got one. Or at least not a handout that other groups didn't get as well. And so I'm somebody that refuses to be shamed for calling out things. The real victim mentality would be to sit there and take it and not say anything or not do anything about it. Isn't that the same thing they tell the women when they're in a particular situation? Speak out, use your voice, let somebody know, and you're considered strong for that, and rightfully so. But they don't play the same game with us. And a lot of you guys know what I'm talking about. And so I refuse to fall for that trick. But back to Rich Paul. Rich Paul said something interesting in regards to the difference between white Americans and European Americans as it pertains to athletes. I'm going to go ahead and play the clip. Take a listen.
A friend of mine who works in sports, and he said that as successful as Rich Paul is, that white athletes and white families, they don't trust a black sports agent. So I wanted to know, is that an accurate statement?
That's accurate, yeah. Now, that's not necessarily, when we think about that, we're not. It's not international players, because international players actually have a different outlook on it.
Wow.
And I represent an international player, Yusuf Nurkic. He's from Bosnia. So he has a different outlook on it. But if you grew up in, Indiana or Georgia or, Oklahoma or even Ohio for that matter, yeah, no.
Do you have any white American athletes?
Not one.
Wow.
No.
Jeez.
I mean, not in basketball. I don't represent.
Right.
No. Right. Yeah. It's. Oh yeah. That's a very tough thing for sure. 100%.
As successful as you've been, that's wild.
Yeah, you would think it'd be a line down the street, but it's not. Yeah.
And so like Rich Paul said, you would think that there would be a line down the street to sign up with one of the most successful agencies in America. But that's not the case. And like Rich said, some of it's trust issues. I'll go with that. I'll agree with that on that one. But I'm going to take it a step further. I want to go a little deep with this one. And I'm somebody that's speaking from experience. Some of that lack of support coming from white Americans in particular. Some of that's coming from a place where these individuals feel like, I can't support you because I don't want you to get ahead of me. And I don't want people who look like you to get ahead of me. Now that's a harsh reality. And either it's true or it's not true. And of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. And I'm not saying that it applies to everybody. But if you think about it, there's a reason they call it race. And that's an interesting word to use when you're coming up with a word that separates groups of people based on skin color. That's a very interesting word to use, the word race. And some might say that there's literally a race to see who's going to be on top, or at the very least, who's not going to be at the bottom. And once again, I'm not saying that people consciously think on this level. But on a subconscious level, absolutely. And I'm going to give you an example. I used to own a smoothie shop some years back, and I remember one of my employees called out one day. And so I had to get behind the counter. I got busy doing my thing, helping out in any way I could. And I'll never forget this. I got to serving this middle-aged white woman, and we got to talking, and she was enjoying her smoothie. And I had the jazz music playing in the background. And so the vibe was cool. The vibe was nice. Great atmosphere. And I could see that she was enjoying herself, and she got to looking around, and then she popped the question. She asked me who the owner was, and I started not to tell her it was me, because I already knew what time it was. But, like I said, the vibe was good. She seemed like, a nice person. And so I told her it was me. I told her that I was the owner. And if I told you that the look on her face changed, that would be an understatement. That would be downplaying it. As soon as I told her that, she couldn't get out of there fast enough. And like I said, everything was cool up until that point. Everything was cool up until I told her that I was the owner. This is my place. Because before that, she probably thought I was the manager or something like that. And that would have been cool. But no, not the owner. Now, that's something that, like I said, that hits a little bit different. And so that's something that I'll never forget. That's something that stood out to me. She went from being overly friendly. Y'all know what I mean. She went to being overly friendly to not being able to get out of that store fast enough. And so like I always say, sports is a microcosm of how society works. They don't mind us playing the game as long as we don't have the ability to change and make the rules. And it's somewhat complicated because I wouldn't say that most individuals think like this on a conscious level. Most people don't have the time to think like that. But that's what makes it somewhat complicated and complex, like I said. But at the end of the day, these are conversations that we need to have and things that we need to understand. And we need to know that we can still do our thing regardless. Like a Rich Paul. Like he said, he may not be able to get those American players, but he can get those European players. Those European players and those families, the only thing they see is green for the most part. Now, it could be a different story if, he was over in their country or their neck of the woods, who knows? But it's all a part of the game. You work with what you got. And you could say what you want about LeBron James. I know everybody has their varying opinions when it comes to LeBron, but one thing you can't take away from him, and one thing that he deserves a lot of credit for, is putting Rich Paul on. Because he didn't have to do that. I'm sure LeBron James had everybody in his ear telling him not to use Rich Paul as his agent. You're talking about a young black man that didn't even have a license or a degree in sports management at the time. That takes a strong individual to take a chance on somebody like that, especially when you're somebody that was as young and impressionable as a LeBron James. For him to go against the grain and take a chance on somebody that he did business with before and somebody that he knew on a personal level, despite, like I said, everybody in his ear telling him to do the opposite and probably go with a sports agent that didn't look like him. I'm sure he had a tremendous amount of pressure to do that and to go the opposite way. But shout out to him on taking a chance on somebody that he knew and somebody that was from the community. And that's what we got to do. We got to take a chance on one another. And of course, we're not always going to get it right. Nobody ever does. I don't care what community you come from. You're always going to have individuals that let you down on a personal level. And they're also going to let you down on a business level. That's life. That's the way it goes. It doesn't mean you give up on a certain people, especially when it's your people within the same community. But then again, sometimes you may have to go in a different direction, just depending on what you're trying to do and your circumstances. But it's not something that we should write off altogether. And so I think that's going to be a wrap on this particular video. Definitely go ahead and chime in the comment section. Let me know how y'all feel on this one. And as usual, peace and chaos.